Il doppio di quelli che hanno detto che venivano. Well, I go I start right now. Welcome to the meeting of this Academy Europe. While you were rightly engaged in concrete actions, in more nations taken by the lockdown, we studied and trained with a cycle of 40 conferences in 3 languages. It was a political preparation to better understand the changing reality and to build a vanguard that gives answers to the future of its individual nations and of Europe. We took advantage of the situation to start the activity of the Academy, which we intend to strengthen by 2022, but which is already operating in some European countries. I take this opportunity to tell you that we intend to hold the summer meeting of Landscape in Provence, southern France, from 23 to 26 July. Yesterday, I looked at the cost of the Krakow-Marseille flights on that date, and they were low, less than 120 euros round trip. Details soon. So I leave the microphone to my comrade, and all question, all observation is very appreciated. Bye.
Okay, thank you, Gabriele. I welcome all comrades which are connecting in this conference, and I would like to start with summing up of what we have done, at least in Italy, on the various items. The focus has always been the fact of trying to train political cards. That means that we have gone to the fundamental. We have tried through various documents and conferences to focus on which are the items which we should really understand in order to prepare to the new phase, the political cards. I would mention the document called Aquarius, which is how to, let's say, position and try to understand what is power at this very moment in the liquid society. I know this definition is very much abused, but probably gives, let's say, a meaningful definition of what has been the object of power for many years. I think that we think that power has changed in its not as in its form, but probably in its structure. And so we think the National Revolutionary Cards should adapt to the new phase in order to have clear ideas on what they're doing, because our sensation is, at least in Italy, we don't know in other countries, of course, but probably we have a clue that sometimes we are going random. We are still in a wrong and old definition of power, and probably we should adapt, in this sense, our new strategy. On the same issue, we have made an effort in making some training courses on communication and language. That means that we should adapt our strategy also to a new way of communicating, a new way of employing language, a new way of presenting the analysis of the society and what's going on, having, of course, in mind the hardcore of our principles, but presenting them in a new way. On the same issue, we have presented the courses of analysis of power, finance, philosophy, trying also on historical terms to repropose what is a third way or tercerista approach. which comes back to the years which were two blocks, of course, in a geopolitical way. But this can adapt as a mentality, a new approach, understanding that the third position probably is a fact of spiritual essence and the way of presenting Europe as a third force, because probably now, of course, Russia is not the USSR as it used to be, but we have still a superpower, which is the United States of America, and on the way we have China, which is trying, let's say, to be the new counterpart. Of course, the new strategy of Trump on the other side of China is to reply what has been the old Cold War. And this is very clear also in the approach of what has been the COVID emergency, in which they still accuse themselves, of course, but they still play as the two main players on the world, in the world. Our main aim is, of course, as I said before, is to prepare CAD to a completely changed panorama, to be updated in order to present, let's say, a contemporaneous view on what is happening and to form a vanguard, which not necessarily should be, of course, related to mass movements, but to create, let's say, a cultural and before them political hegemony. And that's what we are trying to do here now in Italy. And for instance, I will also quote the fact that we launched two months ago a new site, which is called Cultura Europa. This site has had a very good, let's say, response in terms of contacts and interest. We have published more than 300 articles and many interviews, interviewing all sorts of people, first of all related to our ambience, but not only. At the same time, this has meant that we have published once a day article in European language, which helps us also to be really European in the sense that we think that publishing articles in the various European languages creates a culture of community, of being European, in the sense of exchanging languages also, because this is very important, and also to have Italians trying to read in English and French, for instance, and in other languages, which is an effort, of course. But this also means that we are against any form of petit nationalism or sovereignism, better still, which is still a main part of the, let's say, political opposition to the left in Italy, at least. But I think that the situation is the same in other countries. And we criticize from the fundamental sovereignism because it is a reaction and it is a recurrent formula of petit nationalism or little nationalism. We've always been in favor of European unity. We always thought that Europe should be a force, independent, autonomous, with all its political and spiritual power. Of course, the recurrent criticism is that, well, you back the European Union, which is absolutely nonsense. We do not back the European Union. We simply back, in name of realism, every effort to have a European integration. European integration means that since we have many proposals in certain circles of having a European army, we prefer having a European army instead of having NATO or OTAN, better still, having its basis on the European soil. We prefer having a European platform on the internet, which is not Google or other US-based platforms. We, in name of realism, think that any effort in that sense should be backed, which does not mean that we're backing the European oligarchy. which are, I remind, are a summing up of the national oligarchy, because the European Union is a summing up of member states. So in this sense, it's we have a deficit of Europeanism. We have a surplus of sovereignism. That means in the European Union, every member state takes its own national problems, tries to sum it up at a European level, and it depends on the weight of the single countries on who is the prominent country. In any case, the debate actually in Italy is very, we think that it's absolutely crazy, because we have a situation in which the Italian government is trying to criticize the European Union in order to avoid the national problems which we have since 70 years, really, which are structural problems, which are political problems, social problems, and also an economic policy which has been a failure. So to give this back to Brussels, we think it's not really a great idea. I think we think that this is absolutely a fake. In any case, we are realist. We're trying to deal with what is on the table and not with utopia. And being European nationalists, we think that we should back the process wherever it comes. In this way, we usually use this example. When Italy was becoming a national entity, Mazzini, which was an Italian Republican revolutionary, was absolutely acknowledged that the Italian unity was being backed by the Savoia, by the king, but he did not boycott this process because he knew that the unity of Italy was the main value in that moment, and probably he was just waiting to acknowledge that process in order to revolution it. And that happened, in fact, when the First World War took place, and then fascism took place in order to exploit the situation. In changing, of course, the history in that way is the same approach that we have towards European integration. I would, let's say, end this very brief presentation in order to have some questions from you. Thank you.
Hello. Okay, I'm there. Is there some question at the moment? I I don't read question in English at the moment. Okay. Wait just a little bit.
Yep.
What I mean is we can organize something like that, but with some subject, maybe once any month.
Oh, there's a question. There's a question.
Okay.
Can I tell us more about
We have
myself?
a question from Johan. Can you tell us more about yourself?
Yeah, there's not okay. There's not much to say. I mean, I've been a member of third position with Gabriele and many others in the late 70s. I've always I kept up pursuing, let's say, the main aim of Gabriele in trying to have a national revolutionary approach in the recent years, and I collaborate with Gabriele since some years in order to make some analysis and contribute to the various activities which we have in place. That's Polaris, which is a review of high target, the site No Reporter, and many lately the site Cultura Europa. So I've always been in the same field for about 40 years. Is that enough? It's not very interesting about talking about myself, but I mean.
Okay. What's more? Huh? Please go. Where did learn to have a good English? Pretty rare for Italians.
I have a secret. My mother is English, so that's the secret. But in any case, I've kept on practicing English.
Is supporting US in our interest?
No, I wouldn't say so. US makes its own interest. It's always done since they've born. I don't think that the changing of presidency from Obama to Trump means that European patriots should back Trump instead of Obama. It's a different strategy. It's a different positioning. But at the end, it's always the US hegemony. Let's not forget that Trump is not against globalization, as somebody also in our field has misunderstood. He's against a competitor, probably China at the moment, in the globalization, which means also that they have, let's say, a policy of not allowing European goods, for instance, in the US. Let's not forget that Trump, instead of having problems with China, they attacked European goods. And this is the demonstration that Europe should pursue its independence and autonomy without any influence from US and China. Trump is a very good president for Americans. He is not the president of Europeans. There's an objective problem, which is, let's say, not related to the fact that the president of the United States is a Republican or a Democrat. They have different strategies, but the same aim, that is to maintain US hegemony. And in this regard, I think that also the European national field, at least in Italy, I cannot say for other countries, of course, but we've had many misunderstandings. For instance, personally, and with Gabriele and others, we have criticized heavily Steve Bannon. Not because Steve Bannon really had a great incident in our circles, but let's say for a few years, thanks to the fact that the Lega and the populism was mounting, Steve Bannon toured Italy in order to try, let's say, to influence nationalists. I will use nationalist as a, let's say, general term. Let's not misunderstand. We are not nationalists. We are European nationalists. So we have a, let's say, a different position from the general panorama in Italy. But in any case, he has tried to influence the nationalist mouvements in order to try to take them on the US Trump side. To us, Trump is always the president of the United States. That does not mean that we do not make an analysis on the differences which are in the Trump strategy with regard to Obama and the Democrat strategy. But apart from the analysis and try to understand where the tide is moving, in a European perspective, I do not see why we should back one United States president instead of another.
Camille asks why some European nationalists support USA in your opinion. Why they do it? It's because of their ideological weakness, other feelings about European interests. What is a reason in your opinion?
Well, my first answer would be yes, because of their ideological weakness. They do not know history, they don't know European history, and they don't know about First and Second World War US intervention and why they did it. They don't know about post-war US intervention in Europe, Marshall Plan, and why they did it. They don't know about US interference in Europe, let alone the US bases, which are covering literally Italy, Germany, and many other countries. They don't know probably that NATO or OTAN is based in Brussels and has a big influence in all European political choice. They probably moved by sentiment. The fact that somebody, being, let's say, right wing and being against abortion, being against, let's say, I said it before, is not against globalization, it's just protecting the US market. I mean, Trump is a hero for US working class because probably the steel factories in US now are more competitive than they used to be towards European and Chinese markets. But this is not an ideological problem. This is a market problem, as simple as that. So I think that we, having lost a perspective which is rooted in what is Europe and what is the European civilization, where it comes from, which are the deep roots, and which are the ideas, not the ideology, the ideas, I insist, on which Europe has been a civilization for more than 2,000 years. I think that nationalists are losing their time, first of all, and working probably for the Prussian king, as they used to say some time ago. It's a misunderstanding, a big misunderstanding, and this does not help in any way people who are really truly European.
I have something to add. Just one thing. I mean that it is because they live a virtual and globalized reality. They therefore confuse their home with Russia, China, Iran, or any other reality, as if each place was the same as another and civilization was the same. So because they live every time, everywhere, and nowhere, they confuse.
Yeah, let me add some other things. This is not only a problem related to US. I see that ever so often somebody gets in love with some extra-European power. It's happening with Russia. Many actually have said that Russia would save Europe. Now we see that somebody is always acknowledging that China will help Europe. It's a geopolitical problem. It's not, let's say, a problem of having supporters of a football game. We think that Europe will, of course, with Russia, it's a different issue because Russia could be a natural ally. But being an ally in a European perspective means that we are on the same level. We are not on the same level with US and China for cultural, mythical, symbolical, civilization problems. That means that nobody will save Europe. Only Europeans will save themselves. It's the same reason that we're trying to make understand in Italy to nationalists. They think that Italy will save itself only relying on its own, let's say, force, which is out of time, which is absolutely nonsense. For instance, leaving the euro, which is, I mean, it's one of the items which nationalists or sovereignists are always ready to back here in Italy, would be a disaster. In practical terms, in terms of power, in terms of having Italy being even more slave of the US, or maybe better still, of the Anglo-American sphere than before, which I mean it's even very let's say complicated to do so, but in any case it would be even worse. You not because you can print your own money you are free. Apart from the fact that printing your own money without other parameters is absolutely nonsense. You could produce money as you produce, let's say, toilet paper. It probably would have the same value. At the same time, you have no military force. You have no economic force. You have no expansion force. So it's just a wishful thinking. And since I think that we must be pragmatic and realistic, it's the same reasoning. European will be saved by European spirit, not by others.
Another thing you have to tell, maybe a second reason, not always confessed, is the defense of the white race. But Europe is more than the white race, which is not enough to make Europe. And the Western decline comes from the whites. So here too there is a confusion. At the same time, if in Trump you see a breakdown of some balances, it changes and makes more sense. So it depends the way you see that. We have another question.
Yes, I see it. Is there, in your opinion, any other than USA and China in Pacific? The Europeans. The only it's not a financial independence. I mean, we're living in a capitalistic world. Even China, which has a communist, strong communist centralized party, they are a liberal capitalistic economy. So the whole world is capitalistic. The problem of Europe is that we don't have this background, but in any case, the only threat to Europe is the Europeans' mind and spirit. So if we don't achieve the spirit which has moved Europe for many centuries, and it's still there, and that we should bring back. Any other problem, which is the economic system, the social system, is let's say a consequence. But the first thing we should have, the threat that we had, I mean, U.S. threat is not, it has come after the Second World War. We have achieved a cultural U.S.-minded opinion in Europe. It's not only about dressing or listening to the music, it's having the same social models. If Europeans have the same social models, I don't see any difference. It's a state of mind. We have a different state of mind, or let's say some of us. We should transmit and be able to transmit this state of mind to the vanguards. In order the vanguards can transmit this to the people, because we do not have people now. We have masses, and this is a very U.S., let's say, a mass of consumption. People who go to supermarkets, They work, they have a family, they go to supermarkets, they have a, let's say, a private pension scheme. They go abroad until their 70s and they die. That's it. That's the American way of life. This is not a European way of life. It's not
Michel,
been
sorry.
it's not been the European way of life for centuries. And we think that 70 years of this way of life is the European way of life. I would absolutely make a difference between Europe and West. We probably have forgot this. The Western world is the Atlantic world. Europe is a different thing.
Michaud, I apologize for the pronunciation of the Polish name. Written that in the document Aquarius, it is mentioned that European birth rates would take at least 50 years to lower the demographic gap. Policies to increase birth in modern day, Poland and Hungary have worked somewhat, but they are still not enough. What would be a good natalist strategy in Europe so that Europeans have more babies? I have the answer. It's poverty, because it's the power who have children, not the rich. Perhaps the crisis will save us.
I agree with what Gabriele said. Some years ago, I read this article in which they said that the European democratic crisis was because there was not enough money in order for a family to have children. That is partially true. It's a state of mind again. People gave birth to children in years in which hunger was absolutely the rule in Europe. It was a big joke, like with the Irish in the south of Italy. People used to have many children until, let's say, 30, 40 years ago. And they all said, why? Because it's life. Because it's power. Because it didn't really, I mean, many of them, of course, were, as they say, you know, the Marxist thing, okay, they were just there to help the father to as you said, to go to the land and yes. So probably yes, but that does not change the fact that it's the ideology which brings people not to give birth. And the demographic problem is the main issue in Europe. We cannot always say, you know, it's a retrograde battle to say, yeah, well, let's not have the immigrants. Okay, for many, many reasons. We can stay here a few hours to analyze very reasonable reasons for which we would not like to have, let's say, the invasion. But why are not Europeans giving birth to new Europeans? Why is Europe so, it's killing itself in order not to have new Europeans? And this is our own problem, because it's a mentality, and it's probably, it's not a question of money. It's not a question of well-being. Even worse, I mean, if it was a question of well-being, not to give birth to children, it would be abominous. This is not an excuse. This is horrible. And I must say that at least the average rate in Europe of well-being is surely much above what it was a century ago. In any case, I mean, there was people giving birth to children while there was the Second World War, the First World War. What are you talking about?
Other thing, however, the gap can be partially and temporarily filled without being overwhelmed with immigrants, thanks to robotization and thanks to the development of Africa under European influence.
Yeah, okay, but robotization should never substitute, let's say, human beings.
For the work, for the job, yes.
I mean, robotization is one of those things. There should not be, of course, At the same time, I'd say being dominated because it's part of innovation. But at the same time, this cannot be an alibi for not having a demographic campaign in Europe, which, as I said before, it's a mentality problem. It's not a. I mean, okay, you can have governments which have, let's say, allowances for, as it happens in France, for instance, and other countries, in Germany, for instance, which help families. Okay, this is not the case in Italy, I would say, but in Italy there's no family policy whatsoever. At least there's been a few things. I remember something under Berlusconi government, which was an allowance of €1,000 for on a year for every newborn, which is a bit. I mean, it's a typical, let's say, intervention which does not solve the problem. But apart from that, I think it's a problem of responsibility, really. We should regain responsibility of being, let's say, Europeans. And since in other areas, world areas, they gave birth to many children, and since I remember a phrase which said that demography is power, I think that apart from any religious or, let's say, any other political or ideological input, I think this is absolutely true.
There is a question from Giancarlo.
Yeah, I read. I'm reading it.
From
Is
Camille.
there any way, to counter chauvinism, fight with chauvinism between? Chauvinism is absolutely appalling. We should absolutely make an effort to go over chauvinism. I think that two world wars in this case, and I would make a difference between the first one and the second one. I'm not using this as a Democrat argumentation to say, oh, well, Europe should be in peace and love since we've had two world wars. It's not this. It's a question of having a European perspective and trying to think that ethnical, cultural differences are a richness. We are part of a same continent. We have, in different ways, the same history. We share the same destiny. We have our common house is Europe. The fact that we have had many internal conflicts should be absolutely overlapped. And I think that this is a common responsibility if we want to have a future. Because, as I remember, the US has always played, for instance, on the former Yugoslavian crisis. You remember when Slovenia and Croatia started having this nationalistic, fierce nationalistic influence, which then led to butchery with Serbs, for instance, and then from between Muslims and Christians, all on European soil. And then ended in 1999 with the US aggression backed by some European countries, which are NATO members in Italy in first, with D'Alema present in 1999, which led to the bombing of a European capital since the Second World War. That was the absolutely marvelous example on how chauvinism and petty nationalism leads to somebody else exploiting this in order to put everybody against each other. We've had in recent weeks, and Gabriele knows it well, because we've been counter-attacking on this in a massive sense. In Italy now, at least it's slowing down, but in a few weeks, the problem were the Germans. Italy is going down because the Germans are not helping us, because the other European countries are denying us the money, which is not true, because to attentive analysis, this is absolutely a wrong representation of facts. Whoever were being working in Brussels knows that this is not the truth, but that this has been, let's say, transmitted to public opinion. So we have become, once again, anti-German on very, let me say, on really, from a cultural, but also from a factual point of view, very poor analysis, terrible analysis. But at the same time, this is the new, let's say, word that national sovereignists are using in order to avoid a big complex problem, which is the analysis of power on an international, from an international point of view. So chauvinism is our first enemy. The fact that we have had different histories, also had wars inside Europe, should not, at this point, would be criminal, prevent us from having, let's say, a central and let's tell me empire point of view, because Europe must have an imperial future. This is, of course, not the fact at the moment, but we should be really have a European solidarity, and the vanguards in Europe should really put this as the first issue in order to avoid any form of division on which probably the superpowers will play on.
We have a question of Julius. I don't know what from Union of Nations can make Europe a real opponent of US or China, in your opinion. It is something like one super state, like pan-European or not? What kind of state is necessary for nations of Europe and white race? What is more important, countries' independences or unity and strength of Europe? I send the links of our manifests in English and Polish. So it's better because all is written down. So you can see there is manifest we have written last year together. Camille and Lucas were between the people reading this manifest.
To answer this question, I mean, we can debate for hours which form Europe can have in the future, which will probably not influence very much the debate on an international scale. I mean, we can be confederated, federated, we can have, this is not really the point. What we know, because we have to be, let's say, realistic, and the only future we have together is Europe. We have continental blocks, we have geopolitical influence, that is US, China, partially, I would say, at this point, but very partially Russia. But the only way of gaining power in the world is being Europe. I don't know, nobody can know which form this will take, because the facts, we are not, let's say, we don't like theory without praxis. Praxis will tell us which form it will take, but it will also depend on us on which form it will take. Because the fact is, the dynamics is that without Europe, every single state will have, let's say, a failure. It can be, it's not only economic and social failure. We're always talking about economic problems, how European Union will, let's say, give health, and let's say, we become a bit united Americans in this way. We want happiness, health, maybe to have people who are going to be 90 or 110 with a pension scheme and touring the world on in the Bahamas. This is not the point. The point is having a future, which is being power, demography, will of power, and to achieve, probably in the realistic terms, European army, a European power, a European sphere of influence. I don't know in which way this, as a confederation, a federation, a centralized empire, I don't know. I'm not a let's say, in this sense, I cannot tell. The only thing I can tell that if we don't unite, we will be defeated one by one.
Hello? Perché mo succede qualche palle? Ok. More questions? Stefan Temples asked whether, in your opinion, the colonization was a mistake.
Decolonization. Well, I don't like the terms of mistake or it was a good thing. It was in the times. It was a consequence of the fact that Europe had lost the Second World War, not Germany, Europe. And probably United Kingdom lost the war. And that explains very much how the US got in place of the UK Empire and of the French colonies. We all remember the Suez Channel crisis, how it ended and how and why. It's just the fact that US, for instance, fueled a lot of liberation movements in the decolonization process, and which at the same time was a good thing, for instance, for the aspiration of independence of many third world countries. Of course, in the end, it was just a substitution of influence of power from the United States to the traditional, let's say, empires, which were the English one, of course, and the French and the Portuguese, I would add. But it's very influential in Angola, for instance, and Mozambique. We all remember in '75 the big Angolan rebellion against, the fighting between various factions, MPLA, FNLA, and UNITA, which were serving different interests. One was the South African influence, another one was a Marxist Cuban. It's always a problem of sphere of influence. It's not really a question of a mistake, or it's all a question that Europe had lost its influence and was replaced by others. On one side by the US, in the other side in the Marxist field by the USSR, which fueled liberation movements, especially in African countries, Mozambique, Angola, South Africa, African National Congress, for instance. But at the same time, they both had the same will. They both had the same objective. They both had the same sphere of influence. In the end, it was Europe who lost.
Well,
what do you think about awakening of separatists? I would make a big difference between. I'm not a fan of the nation. I'm not really a fan of the nation. I mean, nations have been a very recent construction in European history. Italy is an example. So, for instance, on Südtirol, I would say that I go there quite often. Probably the North Italians at all. I really don't. For instance, in the Irish problem is a exemplification of how British imperialism has tried to smash the island independence attitude, which was absolutely, and I still reckon it, a very good aspiration. But at the same time, nationalism is not a value in itself. To have another nationalism, some to the various nationalism in Europe, could be a good thing or a bad thing. I mean, it's another problem. The problem is being national revolutionary, which is a completely different attitude. Because there you have analysis on the economic system, on the spiritual system, on the social impact of this spiritual system, on the fact that Europe could be really an empire in which each, let's say, ethnical group could have its autonomy. I, I don't really, I'm not in love with boundaries. I'm not in love with boundaries, Corsicans or Catalonian, even if the problem is another one. Probably many times these independence aspirations, which are legitimate, can be exploited for the other, let's say, aims. As I said before, for former Yugoslavia. Probably the people who actually had this aim were in good faith, but as it happens in many times in history, somebody else exploits them for a more general interest, and probably it's not the best of interests.
Uh, just something, they are not the same separatists. The Corsican one is of national popular origin nature. The Catalan one is bourgeois and progressist. The Basque one is racial. The Breton one is musical. They are very different from each other. So we cannot tell all it's good or it's not good. It depends on.
I see another question. Are there any people who have some real political understanding? This is a very interesting question. I would say that the tendency in some circles is surely of having Italy more integrated in the European Union. Probably not in the political sphere, no, but probably in the let's say in the industrial and other productive sectors. Yes, for instance, Lombardia, Veneto, and the north of Italy are actually now integrated with Middle Europa, with Germany, Austria, and the rest of Europe. This is not the same for probably for the South, for a completely different social, economic, and political history, with the South being always being fooled by assistantialism, which has been also perpetuated now by the actual government, but even by the previous government, with assistance, forms of giving money to people which are not productive, really. But I would say that the fact that Italy must be part, and it should be part, even the problem with Italy is not that we are excluded by the decisions at European level. The problem with Italy that the political circles are not interested and don't have, let's say, the freedom, because they are linked to the same powers of Anglo-American circles which have always ruled this country since the post-Second World War. In this case, left and right are the same. Because, for instance, on the right wing, sovereignism is another alibi not to count in Europe and just to say that Europe and Brussels are our enemies, which is absolutely a complete fake. Italy, the problem with Italy is not European Union. The problem with Italy is having a structural dependence since 1945 from the fact that Anglo-American circles have dominated this country in every domain. Also in the financial, productive system. But now we have a necessity, and it's coming out also in the productive sectors, that we have to be part of Europe. For instance, the famous tunnel in the north of Italy, which has been built on the European funds in Piemonte, no? The high speed project between Lione and Turin, has been always relented by Five Stars and the others, and the other parties, also on the Sovereignist Party, have never try to, let's say, go ahead with the works. And this is part of the European corridors, which means that goods cost at least 50% less because you have high speed. You have a system of communication. You're not living in Massachusetts, you're not living in Connecticut, you're living in Europe. And Lione is the nearest place you have with the north of Italy. And it's part of France, and it's part of, let's say, it's part of Germany, it's part of the east of Europe. We're all communicating now, and if we do not understand that we have to have the same approach of communication in Europe as they have in the United States in terms of speed, cost, and the willing of being a power, we will lose.
Or questions?
In what way is a united Europe comparable to the medieval concept of Christendom? That is our heritage. That is our spirit. The incredible task that we face is to get back that spirit and, let's say, transport it in modern Europe. We cannot go back to the forms or to the structures, but we can make them live again. As they live in our souls, they should live in our lives, and we should inform to those principles our actual, let's say, way of, let's say, having hegemony. Try to build hegemony, which is first of all cultural, then it's political, because without a theory and without a spirit, there's no way we're going to change. If we get back the spirit, we can change, and we can change also as a minority. It's always minorities who change. It's never a mass which changes. Have you seen what's happened with the COVID-19 in these weeks? People have obeyed to everybody, to everything. Even the most irrational instructions, which I've ever heard in, let's say, 57 years. I've never heard such a thing. Things have changed week by week. The things that have been said are absolutely no sense, but people followed. So this is not because we have to say, of course, wrong things to people, but we have to get back that spirit. And that spirit is inside us, and we have to be able to transmit it to the others, and to be credible, I would say.
There is a question. Okay, Johan asked how can take contact with you.
I can give you my mail, no problem.
I write there. Lo scrivo?
Sì.
Okay. Okay, Johan, this is the mail of Giancarlo.
Small question for me, because last time it's probably, I remember political soldier there calling. And he wrote about the kind of global counter you are acting. For us, it's quite simple to be. I mean, national revolutionary approach should always be have an anti-imperialistic attitude. I mean, we've always had that as third position in Italy in the 70s, and it was a completely different geopolitical picture, of course. But it's not because that the picture's changed that imperialism is not existing anymore. The problem is that we should also understand that imperialism is mainly US, but there's also sub-imperialism, which are, let's say, sometimes it's a united front. Sometimes it can divide itself in many other different forms.
Miguel.
So, our attitude should always be, I think, for instance, the Palestinian issue. Palestinian issue is being abandoned. At least in Italy, I can say that what it was a struggle of the Palestinians against Zionist has been completely abandoned by, let's say, nationalist movements in its general terms. This because, again, because you have an approach of sovereignism. Sovereignism approach is a completely wrong approach, which is the same as the liberal nationalists. There's no anti-imperialist view. It cannot be, because you're just keeping your own attitude in your home on how life would be so nice if you could go back to, let's say, 30, 40, 50, and then you can go back 50, 70, 80 years back, and how nice it was to have your own garden and your nice small shop, and go and have an exchange of, let's say, Sunday meals with your neighbors. That's what it's all about. There's no political analysis. There's no study. There's no way of approaching foreign policy. All this, who cares? We are just, Italian nationalists, French nationalists, proud of being French, proud of being Italians. Somebody will be proud of being British. What the heck? I mean, this is not going towards this. This is going back to your back garden, and that is why there's no interest in what's happening in the Middle East or Asia. We all there's no analysis, for instance, of what is Islam. They're all jihadists. They're all people who want to kill us. Once, there was pan-Arabism. There was a difference with the Sunni world, Shiite world. For instance, in Iran, it's a completely different view. But who cares? I mean, nationalist extreme right movements prefer to have a sound, let's say, slogan to mobilize somebody who will give them the votes, saying that it's a big Islamic threat. In this way, they pave the way to what has been Huntington, end of civilization, the clash of civilization, which is a US-backed strategy. I'm not saying that it's not a jihadist threat. I'm just saying that it's a completely different attitude which should orient people who are really seeking, part of that, seeking the truth, and then seeking what is really happening. Otherwise, you will make a mistake, and that mistake will be favoring your main enemy.
Well, more questions? What do you think about same non-European elements and concepts of moderner far-right wing like those of René Guénon or Julius Evola or Unger? It's okay to accept in our idea those accents.
What do you think about same non-European? I think Ebola gave a big contribution of the barons Stengen, Ungern, Khan, which are completely different figures, I would say. But it's part of the big European heritage, of course. Both are on one way or reneging on. I mean, but the fact is, apart from citing some main authors, which have really gave a great contribution to our identity, let's say, is how to give the spirit of what you've learned from Julius Leveler and Egan on, or what has been the facts, the battling facts of Ungern von Stenberg. How do you to translate this in practical way of living? Not only ourselves, but also in the political struggle and cultural struggle, I would say. It's the mentality. I think that is the main thing. More than, I mean, those, that spirit should be leading us from when we awake in the morning and when we go to bed. And first of all, and secondly, first of all, secondly, we should transmit this spirit to the people who are around us.
Anyway, Unger Khan is a reference.
Absolutely. No. I'm saying.
And as well, in some way, Lawrence of Arabia.
Yes, absolutely. It's the same spirit, the same mentality. I am a great admirer of Lawrence of Arabia, in fact.
Jacob Blesner asks,
Civic. What do you mean by civic nationalism? Sorry, I don't.
deve essere laico.
Nazionalismo laico?
Credo di sì. Perché Kemalist vision.
Like to me means not much. I mean, it's used mainly in Italian and Latin culture to remark the difference with ecclesiastic view. But it's in Turkey it has a completely different, of course, acception. Yes, like, but at the same time spiritual, which does not mean, of course. Well, I'm Catholic, but that does not mean that I do not know that European tradition can be declined in many ways. But yes, now it's again nationalism more than civic that let's say leads to my attention. Nationalism is not a value in itself.
Stai muovendo troppo, però.
Nationalism.
Stai muovendo.
Sì, ho capito. Nationalist can be a liberal. Nationalist can be a Marxist. Nationalist can be whatever. I mean, nationalism is not a value in itself. Nationalism must have something else. It must be something else. The fascism, for instance, has been overlapping of nationalism. Nationalism was only one of the components. Otherwise, if it's only left to nationalism, it wouldn't be really interesting for me.
Okay, civic nationalism, they ask, Lucas, right, is something like populism, so like Peron.
Okay. Populism is absolutely can be a force. But at the same time, as I said, for nationalism, populism in itself can be a good, let's say, tool, but it's not enough. It's not enough. You have to give to this tool a direction, a substance, a form. Otherwise, it becomes, as I said before, another, let's say, very generic term.
In any case,
like Salvini, Marine Le Pen, or
wait. In any case, we've spoken about three persons: Unger Khan, Lawrence of Arabia, and Kemal Pasha. All of them had an imperial conception.
Okay. Absolutely. Salvini, Marine Le Pen, Orbán, I would say there's many differences between the three. I mean, Salvini, which, let's say, raised many expectations a few years ago in some ambiance, probably, let's say, which nowadays are absolutely out of the big play. There again, it seemed at a certain point that he understood that probably Europe was a big issue, but then the only answer he could give was once again to try to exploit this in the European elections, because he thought that the international sovereignist would have gained a big result, which was absolutely out of any sense of reality. Sovereignists won in some countries, but then again, they're prisoners of their own logic. They're sovereignists. So first of all, their own petit, let's say, garden. That means their own electorate at national level. And that means that they have no projection at European level. Not even another idea of Europe. I can understand that you criticize the European Union. Well, why don't you produce another realistic idea of Europe? They don't have. Because they are prisoners of the democratic approach in which their electorate wants to have that slogan, that, let's say, to say that once it was very nice, now that we have Brussels and the euro, it's so terrible. And that is the end of the story. Which is, I mean, it's a petit bourgeois view, to say the least, and does not solve any problem at all. In fact, for instance, sorry, just one thing to say, that now I don't think that Orban and Salvini or Kurz have the same view. In the end, I mean, they all criticize the Italian government, criticize Austria. Austria says that they won't open the boundaries with Italy, and then, I mean, on the immigration, they have different views. So where this is this international sovereignty doesn't could never happen. I think that Camille says something to you, Gabriel.
I think that we can come in slowly to the end, Gabriele. It was very nice, and I see good potential to expand this English conference soon. Yes, with what we can mean to organize is ever one argument each month. Monthly, we can try to organize it. Yes, one per month, great. So I remember on Sunday, yeah, I remember that the Landscanets, that's probably province 23, 26 July.
Okay, if there are not any other questions.
If Camille tell that we are going, I think he knows because he has the question in Polish, so he knows. Okay, so thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Let me thank everybody for the patience of listening to me.
Yeah, there is another, the last question. Is the Gypsy a nation?
Well, I've never had the intention to be a nation, I think.
I don't know if they can. What is a nation? There is a
Yeah,
people
exactly.
of a nation.
But they've never had, I mean, the nomadic approach, so I don't think
Yeah,
they have.
because a nation without land is.
It's very difficult to create, really. But in any case, I mean, it's not a really big issue, I would say.
Okay.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you very much, and to see you soon.
this should